almost a good day, since we're in two different time zones. More than anyway. Welcome to Talking Smart, conversations with colleagues and friends in education and philosophy from around the world. Today's guest, as I'm fumbling through this, is Laurance Splitter. Professor Splitter has taught philosophy and learning, lifelong learning at the University of Hong Kong, at the University of Melbourne, University of Wollongong, Montclair State University, and all over the world in various little places. And among other things, that I so you owe you a debt of thank you, I guess, or gratitude for when you were with Australian Centre for Educational Research. You were kind enough to invite me to talk to a group of your fellow scholars at ACER, and it was just a joy and a really helpful part of my learning and education to be a part of that conversation. And so I thank you very much for that opportunity and all this other stuff that we've done together directly and indirectly in philosophy of children, including for some time sort of sharing what readers list between thinking and analytic teaching. So welcome and thank you. So
thanks, Mort. Very nice to be here.
yes, and we sort of agreed to. I think that maybe the way we sort of connected again when I called you or started to email you about this. We talked about David Brooks and the work that David.
I'm sorry, I had a phone call. I've just stopped it. Sorry.
That's right.
The perils of. Sorry, let me just get rid of this. I apologize, but please continue.
Well, now the
okay.
we agreed to talk about the work of David Brooks, in particular his kind of his farewell to the New York Times, which was called "Time to Say Goodbye," and in that article, he talked about the role of culture, and also he goes back and makes a reference to sort of in one of the ways that he thought that. Oh my goodness, my mind is gone right now. But he refers back to Burke, and Burke talking about manners rather than culture. And he says, sometimes I think about manners and culture to be kind of interwoven. And he talked about the difficulty of kind of correcting culture. And maybe this is a piece that I've added, but one of the things, and maybe we can use this as kind of a kickoff. I think about people often talk about culture being something we consume and something we create. And I've often asked myself, what's the role of high culture in culture? You know, is there something called high culture? Is how radically different is that from common culture, everyday culture? And so, and how do we go about not just living within the culture that's provided to us, but involving ourselves in and changing that? How do we get involved in the world making process, if that's not too weird a question?
Well, you've raised several questions, needless to say. Yeah, the one about so-called high culture is interesting, isn't it? Because I live in a country which is in Australia, where let's just say there's a bit of the notion of high culture is one which is not all that prevalent. And I guess in some ways, some people would think it was a rather snobbish or elitist concept. It's not entirely clear what it means, but let's say I happen to be a great fan of certain forms of classical music, for example,
Yeah,
right? So,
yeah,
I love Bach and so on. Other people are into art and literature and poetry and so on. I guess these are examples of what some people call high culture. But I don't know. I don't think I have a ready answer to what makes it high, as opposed to just being part of a culture. You've sort of caught me on with that one. Let's keep that on the burner and see
yeah,
where we can go with it. I do think that in Australia, if you talked about what's part of our so-called Aussie culture, again, I should say from that's the start, I'm rather, what's the right word, skeptical about the concept of culture. I think it's first of all hard to define, and I also think it can lead into areas which are rather problematic. We might get there in the discussion, but
yes,
certainly when in Australia, some of us who are really interested, for example, I sing in a choir, and we struggle to get support of any kind from, anyone really. Whereas if we were a sporting club or, especially if we were first class athletes, there'd be money, pouring at us from all directions, including government. So sport here is very much part of the sort of so-called national culture, but I don't think anyone would call it high culture. So I'm sort of, in a way, avoiding that question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it in terms of high culture. Let's keep it on the back burner. Yeah.
yeah, yes. And part of the reason I raised it is because I am in the same position. I don't know what it is in the United States. We're in the same kind of position we are. We have almost no official support for the arts of any kind. And sports is probably as close as we have to a cultural phenomenon. And in the United States, it's NFL football. Um,
And yet you do have certain. I spent a number of years living in New York, and I mean there are some tremendous examples of philanthropy that supported the arts, and you have some really wonderful things going on in the cities and no doubt elsewhere. But so there certainly are examples of what we might call, high culture. Um, and I also know, of course, at the moment, perhaps they're under attack
yes.
because that's another question. The politics of culture, the politics of high culture, it is, I think, seen by some politicians who like to use it to their advantage to call it elitist. But anyway, yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, but going back to the end of that sort of question that I raised about how do we maintain our, well, culture of all sorts, and however we define that, the social milieu in which we live shapes us immensely, but we're not pawns in that shaping. We are active participants in shaping the milieu in whichever we find ourselves. And and maintaining something, and I think what you talk about in one of your papers, in really maintaining some kind of sense of self or authenticity somehow within what we are, and and it seems to me that there are, and this is a part of what Brooks talks about, there are things that we need to address to maintain that, I don't know, status of persons in the world. And I'm mumbling my way through this, and I kind of knew we would, uh, because I'm trying to get at stuff that I think is pretty amorphous, and so, but Brooks raises a couple of interesting questions about one of the things that we need to address is that question of who am I? And
Mhm.
and and I think maybe that's an interesting place to start because I think it relates to all the stuff that we've been sort of mumbling about. So how do we address the question of who am I?
Yeah, well, I'm smiling because, of course, it is a very old and deep question. It's also one that I've given a fair bit of thought to and done a bit of writing about, and I think it does relate to, for example, concepts such as culture, but perhaps in a way which not everyone will agree with. I think the that question, first of all, I think it's correct to put the question in the first person form, first and foremost. But who am I, right?
Yeah.
But the problem there is for some of us analytic philosophers, you immediately think of someone like Descartes, who answered that question by going internally into himself and trying to find a conception of personhood first and foremost with himself as the only thing he could be certain about. And I come out of a tradition which has really questioned that, and says that, look, actually, the idea of who am I, even seeing myself as a unique person, only makes sense if I see myself as being one among others who are also persons, and perhaps also one among others who are not necessarily persons. And for me, what that does, even though it's a bit sort of vague
19
and kind
hours.
of just a general phrase, is that it's a way of indicating or hinting that we need to go between a couple of different extremes or several extremes. And one is this strongly individualistic one, which I think has been prompted by a certain amount of philosophical thinking, perhaps post-Enlightenment kind of thinking, but also politically, that part of the so-called Western liberal, I use the word liberal, knowing it's got many different meanings, but the Western liberal capitalist market-driven, economic tradition is one which still seems to put the individual first and foremost. And whilst that might be great if you happen to be an individual who's done well in that system, but for most people, it's perhaps a different story. So there's, I think, the risks of crude individualism on the one hand, but I also think there's another risk, and that is that I think it's quite a popular temptation, any populist view about answering who am I, by pointing to the associations we have, not just with other persons or other people, but with the groups and collectives and even the tribes or they could be nations or religions or at a more of an extreme, gangs and cults and sects and so on, that there is this view that in order to know who you are, you need to see yourself as something part which is bigger than you. And whilst I agree with part of that, big danger is that the thing which is bigger can consume you, um, can have its own agenda, which can be quite destructive to those who participate in it. And I worry that the concept of culture can be seen in that light. When people talk about, well, in our culture, this is what we do. Well, that may have some truth to it historically, but there are a number of important questions, not the least of which are moral questions about whether or not this is what we should do. Anyway, so yeah, I do think that the question, who am I, the search for identity, and linking it back up to concepts of culture and so on, is important, but problematic.
Yes, and I've been, I'm in a strange intellectual hybrid, I suppose, because I'm really not a philosopher, although I've been involved with philosophy of children. I use the thing educators and philosophers in my talking smart labeling because I think that anybody who is an educator has to be to some degree philosophical. They have to at least struggle with some philosophical ideas, and so so my part of my other background is psychology, which is where I
Right.
taught most of my courses. And it's interesting to look at the way psychologists have defined this self and other and what it, and how, I like the way you talk about the self in relationship to other people. And I think I'm trying to since we talked the last or emailed last, I've been trying to think about that and pull together some of my own ideas. And it's interesting because I think people have developed ideas that kind of relate to this idea, um, going all the way back. I mean, in psychology, it's not that far back, but in 1941, Eric Fromm wrote Escape from Freedom. In 1941, it kind of surprised me when I saw that original publication date. But he talks about the whole business about the person in society and how those two things work with and struggle against. And I don't want to go into the whole thing about Fromm, but he pulls that out of the whole, what, 1500s and Luther and Calvin and all of that stuff and how that moved up to Weber and whatever. But the key idea within all of that stuff is how is it that we find ourselves that we can be persons and not be consumed by society and lose ourselves in that social
Can I just jump in
yes, please.
with a couple of thoughts about, I mean, I think as we know historically, the word philosophy, whilst it's a very old word, um, over time, well, it started out as embracing all sorts of fields in probably just about every discipline, and gradually other disciplines split off, including what was it not that long ago, psychology,
Yep,
right?
yep.
Because if you look at the say the British empiricists and other philosophers, they were at the same time doing a kind of amateur sort of psychology at the same time. So that's one point. The second point, and I'm not a psychologist, but I suspect that even though we are, that is to say, psychologists and philosophers, or some of us, are interested in a number of the same questions,
Mhm.
but of course there is a rather old and perhaps not entirely clear distinction, because as I understand it, psychology sees itself as more of an empirical science. That is to say, its questions are to be answered by going out and finding out whether we're observing people's behavior or whatever it is we're doing. Whereas philosophers, and I say this even knowing that amongst philosophers this is controversial, whereas the methods of philosophy are not quite the same as that. I mean, it's not purely empirical, whatever you might think it is. I think in my case, because I'm coming out of the analytic tradition. For me, there's a lot of working with concepts and trying to get clear about what we're talking about conceptually. So I guess it means I think we have to be careful. When I wrote one of the most recent book 3 years ago, which is oh God, now I'm having a blank. The name of that book, Identity, Reasonableness, and Being One Among Others. Um, I had one of my earlier chapters was a bit of a critique of what I call the social sciences, because I read a lot of material in the social sciences where the question of identity, who am I,
Mhm.
was in a sense seen very much in terms of what are the social connections that I have, what groupings or collectives do I associate with, and so whether it's nationhood or even cultures, whatever that, and I tried to argue that there is actually a stricter, more sort of uh, a concept of identity which comes before that sort of identity. I don't want to throw in terminology just for the sake of it, but there is a distinction between quantitative views of identity and qualitative views. And I think there's a conception in the social sciences that identity is qualitative, but actually, as far as I can tell, the real concept or the pure concept of identity starts off as quantitative. And that allows us to say things which would otherwise seem very peculiar. Like, for example, how is it that I, as a single individual, can undergo significant qualitative change during my life and still remain the same person?
Mhm.
Now, I think I do remain the same person, but that question puzzled even great thinkers like Hume, because if we could say this rather arrogantly, he seemed to be a bit confused about what identity should look like. Strict identity would not involve any change at all, but that's just not the way we think about identity. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is that I think that I I gained from doing analytic philosophy and also logic and mathematics a conception of identity, which I think is a bit different from what I see around in the social sciences by and large. And I think it does actually matter because it allows us to say, well, I can understand who I am, um, and that I am someone who has various qualities and various connections and various associations, but I'm not defined by those collectives and associations, right? Um, and so they don't necessarily control me. So it's kind of liberating the way I see it. So when people talk about their nationhood or their culture or people who are members of gangs who do the most terrible things, you will often hear, well, you will sometimes hear them say, but I had no real choice, because that's who I am. I'm a member of that gang or whatever it might be. Now, this is an extreme example, but there are plenty of kids, tied up in that sort of problem. You see yourself being your own identity, being tied up with those sorts of groupings, then that I think can be very dangerous. First of all, I think you lose a great deal of your own autonomy, and secondly, morally speaking, you have no moral compass because you are told what to do by the group or by the leader of the group or whatever. So that's for various reasons. I think it's worth keeping those concepts clear if we can.
Well, and I my inclination is to look at, like you suggested, many social scientists do, look at self as a qualitative phenomena, and I have to say that that's kind of the direction I come in. But I was also quite impressed with your argument about the quantitative nature of this, and um, that self is in fact quantitative, and it has to do with that idea about the uniqueness of an individual person. I guess that's and and I don't know. I guess I'm torn between those two ideas. And again, that's why I was brought back thinking about Eric Fromm, because a part of what he's saying is that we don't want to get sucked into this world where we lose our freedom because we become like everyone else. And that's not exactly what your quantitative argument was about, but I think there's
Right.
some way that
Yeah.
is making your point.
Well, I have to confess I don't know a lot about from, but possibly that is the case. I'm reminded of a comment made not that long ago by your vice president, who said, really, if you think about who your neighbors are, don't you want to be living around people who are like you? You don't want to be living amongst people who are not like you. And I think it might have been the Pope or someone quite powerful who basically came in and said, no, that's actually confused. And I am siding with the Pope if that's what he said, because I think there's some real problems here. One of them is that I very much do value the idea of diversity, of difference. At the same time, if you have a concept like community, and over the years we've been very attached to, e.g., the notion of a community of inquiry, right, or community of
Yes.
inquiry, as you might say. So the notion of community does, by definition, suggest commonality. So there's a bit of a problem there, and one that I think is not perhaps quickly dealt with, and that is what kind of community is most conducive to sharing things that we have in common and yet still allowing the diversity that I think we need to be, to be full persons. That to me is quite an interesting question. Yeah.
Well, and it's so interesting because this is not intended to be a political discussion, but it ends up being. And I don't know how closely you followed the goings on in Minneapolis, but Our daughter lives.
Closely enough.
Yeah, our daughter
Yeah,
lives in St. Paul, and so she's been real close to all of this stuff.
right.
And the thing you were talking about that to the Vice President Vance and his comments, the St. Paul people have an answer to that, and it's surprising because you hear that in their everyday discussion. They do not talk about immigrants. They do not talk about uh, outsiders. They talk about neighbors. The
Yeah,
reason that they're supporting these people is because they're our neighbors. And just as a,
sure.
I want to give
Yeah, I
you,
mean, it's. I've been watching it, but of course, I'm also 12,000 miles away or more. But and of course, in anything that has a political kind of flavor, one's own politics, affect the way you see it, right? And
yeah,
I'm no Trumpian. So, um, but yeah, and I think this is in a way connected to what we've been talking about. The topic of immigration. It's a big topic here as well, and it's going to get bigger. And it sadly gets tied up in political context, and it becomes a real source of polarization. Um, I heard now, who was it? It might have been an American journalist. I've forgotten. Someone very recently talked about him having a concept of immigration, which of course affects culture, but it's not the only thing. His view of immigration was a very high fence with a very big door,
yes,
um, or big gate. And it seemed to me that that was kind of a nice idea because it's obvious that you can't have what you would just call an open door policy. We're not going to talk about migration per se, but then you have to say, well, so what are the criteria? Blah blah blah. And your point about people in Minneapolis and St. Paul seeing themselves as neighbors, to me, that's a way of saying we see ourselves first and foremost as persons uh, who are among us, right? Who we grow up with and we have contact with, and those relationships are vital because my own personhood depends upon the strength of my relationships with others, and also on the way in which together we confront the world. Now, this is a sort of triangular thing that
right.
the philosopher Donald Davidson and a number of other writers, including psychologists, talked about. So I'm not saying anything new here at all. But to me, that can be described and indeed needs to be described without reference to things like cultural sameness or indeed any kind of sameness. Because in some ways, the more diverse your contacts that you have, the richer your own thinking will be, the more perspectives you have to consider, etc., etc. It also ends up giving a very big place to language, which is another topic, I suppose. And I don't mean language as in, oh, we should all speak English. I don't mean that. I mean
Right.
the idea that language is an incredibly important, aspect of being a person, in my view. Yeah, so yeah, I mean the whole Minneapolis thing has become, it's really been quite, it would be ludicrous and funny if it wasn't so tragic,
Yes.
because I don't know the states completely, but you'd be hard pressed to find a city further away from the borders that are of concern, right? It's not the Canadian border that's of concern to people really, and then you've got Minneapolis sitting up there near the Canadian border, and it's just a bit strange, yeah.
Well, but and the interesting thing about that is the Somalis, who are even further away from Minneapolis, are one of the major minority communities in Minneapolis. And I think this little incident kind of connects much of what we were talking about. Lyda, our daughter, goes to one of these. Well, one of the things she does once a week since all of the stuff started happening in Minneapolis was going to the synagogue, not to the synagogue, to the temple, or the mosque, um,
Okay.
and they have a food distribution place that goes out of the mosque, but it's not necessarily for people who only go to the mosque. It's for all the people who might need food, and so, but they do have a lot of food that is in Hala, and so the rabbi or the imam was talking to the group, and one of the parishioners, I guess, came up to them and started to explain Hala to the people that are going to distribute the food. And the imam said, "Oh no, you don't have to explain Hala to these folks. These are our neighbors." And that crosses all kinds of stuff about culture and language and how we relate to people as individuals and groups. And I thought that
Yeah.
a telling.
You're making me think of a few things. One of them is that it's probably one of the most currently fraught topics there is at the moment, not just immigration, but how it's tied up in many people's minds with religion. And we have issues going on in Australia at the moment, and I happen to be Jewish, and I don't think we should talk about all of that. There is all this confused discussion about can you be, pro-Jewish and anti-Israel. I don't want to talk about that. I think it's very problematic. But what I did want to say is that one of the things that I think we need to keep an eye on, and how to say this without coming across as, offending people, is that there are some major religions, and the two that come to mind most obviously are Christianity and Islam, which are historically and at their heart missionary. At least they were. Um, and so you've got a bit of an issue there, because you could infer from that, therefore, that there is some sense of moral um, obligation to get other people to see the light and join us, especially if they want to find their way to heaven or paradise, or whatever it is. And we know over the centuries that that's led to a great deal of conflict, right? Um, and that's the first point. I think I don't want to go further with that, but nevertheless. And the other point, of course, is that perhaps it is connected, that a little bit of logic helps here. Um, there are some people, in fact, there's an Australian politician who's on the far right gaining support, as they are all over the world, and saying things like, well, we shouldn't let any Muslims in because basically they all stand for the same thing, which is worldwide jihad and uh, what are some of the other words? The globalizing the intifada and having Sharia law everywhere. I mean, and this is clearly nonsense. And I think it's good and important that ordinary Muslims stand up and say, no, this is bullshit, right?
Right.
But of course, it's also the case that there is terrorism around the world that happens. And we had our own experience here in Sydney a month ago or so. And a lot of that terrorism happens to be Islamic, right? I mean, that's just an empirical fact. So we've got to be careful how we deal with that. That's one thing. Could I just make one other observation, Mort,
Yeah.
in case we don't get to say it? The concept of identity politics is one which I think has been thrown around a lot.
Mhm.
My own view about, and it's been used particularly and very successfully by those on the political right to attack those on the so-called left, right? I mean, I'm not sure that left and right have a lot of meaning anymore, but certainly in the States, Republicans versus Democrat. And I think there was a certain amount of truth to it, that the Democrats were accused of caring more about specific groups that had suffered and been discriminated against. And of course, there were the examples were things like, transgender people and so on. Now, I don't want to talk about those examples, but that just became caricatured and it became ridiculous. And the idea was, well, you care more about these. Wasn't it one of Trump's advertisements or commercials? You care more about they, which pronoun to use, they or him or her. I care about you.
Right.
And that all sounded very nice, except it ends up being garbage, because there's just as much so-called identity politics happening on the other side. And as one example of that, I was reading very recently a trend which has been around for a while now, and it's very powerful, especially I read about in Europe, where it's become very appealing to a lot of young males, boys and young men, to identify with certain groups. Now, there are some words for this, and I've now forgotten what they are, but there's a sort of cultural collective thing where you join this group, or almost joining, but you see yourself as part of this. And so you're associating with people who are xenophobic, racist, Christian nationalists, right? And you can see how dangerous that will be. Well, that's a kind of identity politics, but happening very much on the right. And I don't have a glib solution to issues of identity politics, and I don't think it would be a political solution. I think once again, if we keep in mind that what defines us as persons is our relationships with other persons, first and foremost, I think that helps us to keep things a little bit clearer anyway.
No, I think that's, I mean, you think that's exactly right. And I think, well, my example was intended, at least in part, to look at that person among persons idea, the way that that little scenario unfolded with the imam and in the food distribution. And again, that's regardless of what you think about other larger Islamic issues, that one small issue in one small community had interesting implications for me.
Yeah, I guess from looking at it from a philosophical point of view, and again, neither of us are these days practicing theoretical philosophy, but it struck me as one of the sort of puzzles, if you like, that the waxing and waning of religion over the centuries, and it seems to be having a bit of a resurgence in many parts of the world. I can't help but feel that there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that, and I read this historically, that religion has been a fantastic source of a sense of belonging to something, over the centuries, right, from time immemorial. And I get that because belonging to something is important. But the other thing, which I think is more problematic, and I just wish that philosophy itself has been able to articulate this more widely and more clearly, is the belief that you cannot have any real morality unless it's part of some kind of religious framework. So the notion of secularism is now being used again politically, as a kind of nasty word to describe that you're basically a moral relativist or you don't care about anything or whatever. And I think to myself, well, what a pity we can't bring people like, well, whether it's Aristotle or Kant or John Stuart Mill, they had different views about morality, or Confucius,
Yeah.
right? But it seems to me they would all say, and perhaps I'm just wrong here, they would all say, of course, we can only talk about our perceptions where we live. So we are bound up in different societies, different times, and so on. But to the best of my knowledge, the writings of these great thinkers was not confined, e.g., in Confucius's case, just to the Chinese people, nor was Kant talking about morality of if you're German any more than John Stuart Mill was talking about if you're British. They were talking about morality in the sense of this is what being a person is about, and I think that's very important. But then it's my bias because I'm coming out of philosophy.
Well, no, but I think there's that idea is much more widespread, but maybe not clearly articulated. But because I think that's the kind of stuff that that psychology tries to address as well in terms of looking at how it is that because, well, again, well, here's a little example of a flow of ideas. You take a writer, a psychologist like Carol Gilligan, and her first major work was In a Different Voice, which was largely a feminist voice. But I think her most recent book is called In a Human Voice. And she has, over time, worked through those ideas, including how that relates to things like paternalism and patriarchal societies, and how that is an element in recognition and then allowing for a more human voice that is neither a feminist voice or a masculine voice, but a human voice. And I think
You're making me think of a couple of things more. One is that I'm well aware of my own background coming out of so-called analytic philosophy, or Anglo-American, and that there's a whole uh, stream of philosophy that I don't know what the right word is, whether it's postmodernist or continental, whatever, who talk much more about um, who would criticize the way we're talking by saying, well, you're ignoring, for example, the dimensions of power and the role that power plays in all of the ways in which we see each other. And so you've got writers like Foucault and so on, about whom I know very, very little and struggle to understand. That's just my own background. Um, the other thing about you mentioned uh, Gilligan talking about in a human, how did you put it?
A
In a
human voice.
human, in a
Voice.
human voice, yes. This may sound a little bit nitpicky, but it's worth saying that, of course, one of the things that philosophers and philosophy students love to talk about is the difference, if there is one, between being human and being a person. But that's
Yeah.
perhaps a bit by the way. We don't really have to get into that now. I just think that it's worth keeping open the idea that they're not the same concept, and that in terms of what we've been talking about, it may be that personhood is the crucial conception, because otherwise you get accusations like the one made over the years by Peter Singer, that we tend to be very speciesist, that we think that there's something special about Homo sapiens. Um, the relevance of this, I think, as time goes on, is going to be very much in connection with AI, because and again, this is a whole other topic we don't need to talk about, and goodness knows I don't have profound thoughts about it. But I think one of the great fears is this idea that AI will eventually replace us. And I suppose my view is, well, that doesn't bother me particularly, A, because it's not going to happen directly in my lifetime, and B, more importantly, is because it's possible that humans, as in Homo sapiens, will ultimately evolve out or go extinct, just like Homo erectus and Homo Neanderthal, whatever Neanderthalis did. Um, but the concept of person might prevail if the things that replace us, whether they're machines or whatever, can be classified as persons. And that's a discussion which I think is interesting and fun to indulge in, because there are some people that say, well, no, you couldn't possibly have inorganic persons, but I'm not so sure about that. I don't see why that's not. Anyway, so I do think that AI is going to be one area where talking about personhood versus
Yes.
human beings is going to be interesting.
Well, yeah. I, I said in my notes when I was thinking about all this stuff, we probably will have to talk about sometime or another about AI. And but and this is maybe changing topics too much, but my big concern with AI is what the many versions of that do that prevent the development of thought in
Oh, what,
person,
sorry?
of thought in persons,
Yeah.
the ability to think. And if AI can summarize War and Peace better than I can, that's a great loss for me, and not it has nothing to do with AI, because the value of my summarizing that is working and thinking through that and not figuring it out and figuring it out
Yeah.
and being wrong and figuring it out again and being wrong and eventually getting some sense of what it's all about.
Yes, and I think it's genuinely an open question as to whether there will always be a role for us or we humans in that, or whether you could imagine a sort of scientific sci-fi horror movie where over time the AI takes over, does all the real thinking, and then what are we? We're sort of like just pawns, or we become the robots in a funny sort of way,
Yeah, yes,
because the
yeah.
real thinking is done, the real thinking is done by them. I remember reading not that long, no, who was it again? I think an American professor talked about how many of her students quite openly and blatantly submit assignments that are written by Chat GPT, right?
Yeah.
Um, and because they know they can just get A's and so on. Now, leaving aside the question of how good the technology is to pick this up, because there are some programs like Turnitin that can pick up some of this. But she said, what the students are saying, well, why shouldn't we do this? Because they can do it better than we can. And she said this, I've forgotten her name, doesn't matter. She said that the problem is they're going to graduate as engineers, thinking they know something about engineering when they don't know anything. What's going to happen out there when they're in the field? Well, I suppose one answer to that is that'll be all right because it'll still be AI that's actually making all the decisions in when they're out there in the field. And so the question then becomes, which is what you were getting at, I think. So where does that leave us? In not just in studying, but in the world itself. It is, I think, an interesting question.
Yeah, and I do think that, and again, I was kind of hoping we could kind of bring this in some ways back to the whole issue of education and why AI and classical tomes um, are worth spending time with, and what the value of that is, and what that has to do with us being persons. And I
Sure.
think,
That- you're providing an opening for me which I cannot resist. I'm making my own podcast at the moment, or trying to. I've made about 6 episodes, and they're coming out about fortnightly. And I love people to listen and perhaps subscribe if they're interested. May I just mention it's called "The Rest Is Uncertain," at the intersection of philosophy and public life, and it should be available on all the major. It's completely free, but and I'm still in the early stages of it. But one of the I do have a couple of episodes on education and on schooling and so on, and of course that's a very big area and lots of things to say about it. E.g., I wish we spent more time on teaching young people not just the so-called traditional literacy skills, but on being more effective talkers and listeners,
yes,
because I'm one of those who thinks that people who can engage in dialogue are going to be much better equipped to deal with the world than those who don't or can't. That was one thing I wanted to say. Um, I was also, but there's another thing which will come up in a minute. So let me. It's gone from my mind just at the moment, as things do. Um, but you mentioned you were hoping we would. Oh, you said you were hoping we would touch on something to do with education. Um, yeah, I guess it is. It is, I suppose, making us think about what we think the true aims of education are. I mean, one of the things I did, I went back in a little bit of a history of people writing about education, some of the great thinkers and so on. Going whether it's Aristotle or again Confucius or John Dewey, Paulo Freire, John Locke, Rousseau, and I found that a lot of them used certain terms repeatedly. So there were some themes that kept coming up: being a good thinker or a critical thinker, and also being an ethical, well-rounded person, and so on and so forth. And some of this language, of course, prevails in educational theory, right, in documents and mission statements. But the question is, and again in Australia, I know it in some detail, but a lot of that goes by the wayside because you've got too much pressure coming from governments and indeed parent groups for success, for scores, for achievement, for outcomes. So a lot of that wisdom, I think, gets thrown by the wayside. And I now remember what it was I was going to say when you were talking before about having being educated in a sense for its own sake, so that you can actually do things which are worth doing. Yeah, I guess that's another discussion that again is, I think, influenced not in a very productive way by political and commercial forces that still seem to confuse what some of us might call education with training, with
yes,
learning how to do something so you can go out and be good at this and have a good job and a career and so on and so forth. And we still struggle, I think, with that distinction. Funnily enough, goes back to what we started with, which was questions about culture, including high culture, um, and the appreciation of these things because in their own, for their own sake.
yes, and yeah, yes, and again, this may be I don't know if I'm stretching things, but I've been fascinated just in the last couple of months or so, because I have been kind of trying to reread together people that ended up having for years been in conversation with each other. Eric Fromm, Paul Goodman, Paulo Freire, and Ivan Illich. All of those people not only did by correspondence, but sat down together and talked about stuff. And
Yes, you're exposing my ignorance here because I haven't read enough of them, unfortunately. But yeah,
I mean,
That's good to
I
know
mean, I
that.
think we could all think of other examples of those
Yes.
people who we see their ideas, and this is maybe far off, but what is it, Braque and Picasso? Apparently, in one of their periods, they talked about this kind of painting, and then I saw it in the portrait. No, I don't know, but one of the museums in London. There was a Braque portrait I mean, not a portrait, but a picture and a Picasso picture. And they looked almost identical. And neither one had seen each other's work. They had just talked. I mean,
Right, right. Interesting. Yeah, that raises a whole lot of other questions which we don't have time to talk about. But what kind of thinking? Matthew Lipman, philosophy of children, right, and others have talked, and Anne Sharp talked about the notion of caring thinking and creative thinking being different from critical thinking. And I've always been puzzled about it, but we don't have time to talk about it now. But creative thinking, the outcome of a creative thinking may be a work of art. And maybe people who are truly creative thinkers don't need to converse linguistically, but they can still nevertheless relate in various ways. I mean, that to me is an interesting, puzzling matter. I teach a couple of voluntary classes in what's called in Australia the University of the Third Age. So basically for
oh,
retired people.
yeah.
I've been doing it for some years and I run a couple of philosophy classes. And I started one because it's here is the start of the academic year, basically.
Oh,
And we started a group last week and one guy professed to be, he made it very clear that he was not coming out of analytic philosophy. He was coming out of what he called the continental or postmodernist tradition. And it was very clear after about 10 minutes that he wasn't going to be happy with the class. But he made one claim, which I found very odd, and that was that he didn't want to talk about any history, any historical philosophers or thinkers, because he thought that's history. He wants to just dwell on what we think now about things. And I thought that was a really strange thing to say, because, of course, anyone who's taught philosophy does, I think, value going back and rereading and rethinking great thinkers. And it's not necessarily just doing history. I mean,
oh,
although it's important to see that they were indeed human beings living in a particular time and so on, but that's not what we're primarily doing. We're going back and looking at their ideas because they still have currency and they still are worth talking about. But this guy, he wasn't having any of that. I thought it was rather strange. Yeah.
well, well, anyway, I think this is, I probably started this conversation all wrong, but this is kind of where I wanted to go. And that is talk about how lots of disparate things kind of fit together and are a part of the way we try to engage ourselves in the world that we find ourselves in, and how
So,
it is that we maintain this
so
self.
I think there are some slogans around about the notion of dialogue, for example. You should follow the dialogue or the inquiry where it leads, which may seem a bit strange to some people, as though it's got a life of its own. But as long as we are trying to maintain some sort of structure and direction, which I think we've made a reasonable attempt at.
Yeah. I think we have to, and it's great fun to engage with you in this way. And so, um, let's just see what would you like to say in summary, your parting thought as we end this conversation.
Um, well, not really, because in a sense there'd be nothing that would kind of, summarize.
Hey,
I've enjoyed the conversation. I've perhaps been a bit mischievous and sort of undisciplined in wandering off into all sorts of different areas, but you've been very indulgent about that, and I appreciate your comments as well, Mort, and the opportunity to share with you the conversation and to broaden the field. People I hope will listen and perhaps talk. Um, I don't know whether you invite feedback yourself on your
uh,
podcast, but
I have an open comment. People can
yeah,
open comments.
yes, and I'd like to do that my own podcasting. Um, as I said, I'm in the early stages, and I also want to do what you're doing, but I haven't got there yet, which is to have actual real life conversations with others. At the moment, I talk a lot about concepts like dialogue, but it's actually only my voice, which is a little bit paradoxical. But hopefully we'll get there. But I do want to thank you very much for the invitation, and it's been really good fun and very thought provoking. So thanks very much, Mort. I really
Okay.
appreciate it.
And I will end it, but we can stay talking.